Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be looking at papers. So obviously in traditional media you get to pick the type of paper that you're going to be working on. So with watercolour paper like Arches or Blockingford. Pastels, obviously I prefer sanded papers or Canson textured papers. And then you've got oil. A lot of people like to use gessoed board or on textured canvas. And then pencil and charcoal, you tend to kind of just use, similar to watercolour paper, certainly a light grained paper in order to get some sort of texture to allow you to have layers. So we're going to do this in 4 different sections. The first one will be looking at watercolour papers. Then we've got pastel, then oil, and then pencil. And this is all going to be today in Artrage because I think the ability to show the texture and grain of the paper through the medium that you're using is really easy to see how that works in Artrage in particular. You can do it in Procreate, you can also do it in Coral Painter just as well. Coral Painter is a lot more complicated. It's not as easy to show you without zooming in ridiculously far to be able to see it. So we're going to stick with Artrage today and we're going to show you what I'm talking about. So we're going to start with watercolour paper. So we're going to go up to File, New Painting, and then you get your New Painting box basically with all the different information. I don't tend to use the screen size section when creating paintings, mostly because I'm using an old TV as a monitor, so it's all in very weird resolutions, which doesn't really make for great painting sizes. So go to print size. Now in Artrage, in the presets, if you go to print sizes, the standard print sizes that you get with the program are A3 and A4, both in landscape and portrait in 300 dpi. As you can see in my box, I've added a few standard Glycé print sizes, and then on top of that some other A size paper, so A5, 6 and 7, so some of the smaller sizes. So today, just because we are looking at paper, I'm going to stick to the 10 by 8. If you guys are interested in me talking about print sizes and showing you how to set that up and how to create your own in Artrage, let me know in the comments below and I can do a quick tutorial video on that as well. So I'm going to pick 10 by 8. As you can see, it says width 8, height 10 pixels per inch, so your DPI 300. I'm going to switch these two around because for the case of the demo I prefer to work in landscape, and it's currently in portrait, which is okay for some, but I'm just going to be really picky. Right, the next section, the important section, and what we're going to be talking about is the canvas, so what we're going to be painting on. If you select the text box there and go to canvas settings, you can see here that we've got all our options for canvas. If we go to canvas presets, you can reset your canvas color and pretty much reset everything for your canvas back to this, which is the standard canvas settings in Artrage. Now we're going to be looking at watercolor first, so we can go down to paper. And these papers tend to be the best sort of papers I would recommend. There is other papers in here that you can kind of look at, not just papers but canvas as well. The decorative papers and pattern papers tend to be flat, so they don't really have texture, especially the pattern papers, which we'll talk more about shortly. So I would certainly stick to papers that you know have got texture, especially if we're looking today at texture. So the most easiest one to use, the most common one to use, in Artrage for watercolour is going to be watercolour paper. So we're going to select watercolour paper, and you can see straight away in the grain section, you can see the grain of the paper, and also there's a preview of it with the brush mark across it, so you can kind of see how it looks with the brush mark across it. The canvas lighting button, please leave checked. You can turn it off, but I would always recommend leaving it checked. Basically, it would be like holding a light source over the top of your paper, and everywhere where you've got your little dents and dings from the texture and the grain of the paper casts a shadow. And having the canvas light on basically casts that shadow so you can see the texture on the paper. Otherwise, it's very hard to see the actual texture on the paper. So, we've then got canvas colour. Well, that's kind of self-explanatory. You can play around and set pretty much any colour you want on the canvas. I'm just going to leave this for white for now. Opacity for your texture, I would always leave it at 100%. You want the texture there, that's the whole point of it. You can bring the opacity down and have less texture, but you can do exactly the same by lessening the grain size and the roughness. So, not really sure what the whole point of that one is. Metallic is great fun if you fancy painting on tin foil. You can do, and I really recommend playing with metallic if you're going to do pastel work, and I'll talk about that a bit later on, and the effects you can get with that are quite cool. You've got your grain here. If you click on the side arrow and go select from collection, you can change the grain. There's quite a few grains in here, as you can see, but for what we're doing, we are going to be sticking to the sanded grain, which is what we've got here. Grain size, if I pull this up, you can see that the grain size in the preview window up here is getting bigger. So we're going to stick to around about 100% for the time being, and then I will show you again with a larger grain size. Roughness is pretty much exactly the same. It's how much of the texture is on the paper. So if I take it down to 0 or minus, you can see in the preview window that the brush mark has pretty much got no texture at all. And as I pull it up, you can start to see the texture coming through the paint. So we're going to set that to about 40%. We've got our grain size 101, roughly about 100 basically, and everything else. So we're going to hit tick and OK that, and there is our piece of paper. So we will go to watercolour brush. I tend to prefer delicate on dry, heavy bleed, or the unclean as well is another good one. For the case of this, we're just going to use delicate and dry. The reason for that, for this demo, is because the delicate and dry tends to have a flat inner surface and a more pigmented feathered edge when you're painting. So you'll see that in just a second. We are currently in a really luscious orange colour, so I'm going to up the brush to 300% so we've got a big enough brush. And then we're just going to layer some of this on the paper. Okay, now what we will do is zoom in, and as I zoom in you can see that the texture of the paper. If I zoom in, there it is. If I zoom out, you can see that the texture is also affecting the edge of the paint. Now, in watercolour I tend to use either one of those 3 main brushes, and then if I'm going to do like a wet on wet technique, I would blend everything out with the Cast Chaos brush. And as you can see, it just feathers it out and blends it out like it would if it was bleeding out on a wet paper. And you can see how that's following the grain of the paper slightly. So that is standard watercolour paper. If I zoom in, you can just about see the very, very tiny pebbly paper. Now, if I go back to File and New, back to Canvas, ignore my screen size, because at this point screen size has picked up the sizes from the print size we previously selected, because it will continue picking up what you've previously selected. So we're just going to ignore that, go back to canvas settings, and we're going to see the grain size, and we're going to up the roughness and the grain size. So we want it rough and we want big grains, and we're going to hit OK to that, and OK. Now you can see there's a lot more gaps and distance, and you can see the pebble effect quite clearly. So we'll go back to our paintbrush, and note the edges on the watercolour brush marks are now a lot more jagged. So as I do this, you can see that they're a lot more jagged than they were before. And if I blend it out, it doesn't go as far. And that's because the texture and the paper is holding it back. Pretty much like you would have if you were using quite heavily textured paper. Obviously the difference there is if you were doing wet on wet rather than this, which is a dry and then blend out, it would run and you would get little runnels following the texture of the paper, which can be quite good depending on what you're doing, especially if you're doing kind of like snow effects and things like that. Really good with very wet splatting. So that is the standard watercolour paper. Now we'll just take a look at one other paper for watercolour. What shall we pick? We'll go back to papers and we'll do cockled. So this is the cockled paper. You can see the grain, it looks more like clouds. Won't quite look like that on the paper, but we'll have a look at that when we see it. The roughness on this is already preset to 100% and the grain size set to 50. So I hit OK and OK to that, and you can see straight away, you can see this texture a lot more clearer. So we'll go to our delicate on dry. We're still at 300%. As I pull this across, you can see that the heaviness of the texture in the paper, which is a lot heavier than the watercolour paper, leaves this weird pattern. I'm not really sure what to call that, but leaves this weird pattern, and you can see the edge of the brush itself is really, really bitty. So if I take another colour and paint on top of that, you can see that the texture remains. And if I go to Harsh Chaos and blend out, then you can blend out, and obviously you, like you would if you use lots of water, you would start to lose the textures. You wouldn't be able to see the white bits of the pits in the paper. They would no longer be white because of course added water, it pulls in those and colours them up, so you wouldn't see them as much. So there is a rougher textured paper suitable for watercolour. That one is called Cockled. So next we are going to move on to pastel papers. I'm going to show you a standard grain sanded paper and then move on to one of the specialist paper. Right, so we are now going to move on and look at some pastel papers. I've got two in particular that I want to show. One is a personal favourite and I tend to use it for pretty much all my pastel paintings when working in Artrage, and the second one is, well, it's a special paper and it's more for kind of fun projects. It's also great for font lettering as well. So we're going to go to File, New Painting again, and we are going to go to Canvas and Canvas Settings. So we go to the preset list and we're going to go down to art papers, and we're going to go to sandy paper. And you can see straight away that the grain is a lot harsher than the previous papers we looked at in like watercolour. You can see in the preview window that there's kind of almost slightly speckled effect. Your grain size is slightly larger at 128%, your roughness also slightly higher at 67%. We can play with that to our heart's content to get different size grains of sand onto the paper, but I quite like the preset that Artrage has got in it. It gives you just enough texture to make it believable. So we're going to hit the tick on that and hit OK, and straight away you can see this almost kind of, well, it's like looking at a beach from above basically. So we'll just zoom out and we will go to our tool picker and select pastels. For this example we're going to use a medium pastel for what we're going to have a look at. Set our brush size to 300 again so you can see what we're doing, and I'm just going to pull it across the paper, and straight away you can see the texture through what we're doing. And the more I lay down, the more fuller it's getting. And obviously, as before, you can smudge it out just like you would be using with your finger. Several different types that you can use. I often use the heavy blood frosting just because I think it gives the best effect. It is a lot softer, so it's more like if you really properly scrub with your fingers, but it's totally up to you. I would play around. I've got several palette knives blenders which I've set up myself, and at some point when I get my new website up and running, we will set up a download page so you can pick those up for free from our website. So yeah, you can see pretty much it blends out fine. Let's pick another colour and go back to pastel and just go over the top of that, and there's the grain. Go back to file and new painting, and back to our canvas settings, and we're going to increase our grain size to 400% and hit OK. And you can see the kind of wavy patterns of grains that you could see in the sanded paper previously is now a lot more spread out. And if I drag this across, you can see that we've got much bigger gaps between each of the grains. We'll go back to file and new painting, back to our canvas settings, and we're going to bring our grain size down to about 50%. Okay, and you can see a lot more of the pattern on the paper if I zoom out, and then if I do this, you can see that the texture itself is a lot more closer together. Okay, so that's the kind of basics on a sanded paper for pastel. So now we're going to look at one of the specialist papers, and we are going to go back to canvas settings, go to our presets at the top and go down to special, and we're going to go to blackboard. It's pretty much what it is. It's a blackboard style paper, so it's based on like a painted blackboard surface. So hit OK and it loads that. And we've still got our brush at 300%. I'm going to give it a slightly lighter colour so you can see what we're doing. Take this up to there and just go. And straight away you can see pretty much what you would get if you're using chalk is you would get a fine, flat, even spread in the middle of what you're doing, and at the edges you would get a soft, furred, blurred out edge. If I zoom in, you can see that really clearly. The very tight speckling of what would be a textured painted surface. And you can see, if I zoom in a bit more, you can just see those speckles of the paint showing through where the pastel is. So exactly like you would be putting chalk onto a blackboard. I think this is absolutely brilliant. I absolutely love playing with this. I don't really have much use for it in fine art, but I often will sometimes use this for creating chalk lettering style fonts, and then transferring that over to something like Sketchbook from Autodesk for actually turning into a proper font. But it's absolutely brilliant for doing kind of font letterings and getting that proper, really soft chalk style texture onto the paint, the blurred edge. So yes, that's rather rainbow now, going a little bit overboard on that colour. So that is my two favourite papers on pastel, and next we will look at our oils. So our next paper we're looking at is going to be papers for oil painting. So we're going to go back to new painting, back to our canvas settings, and we are going to go to canvas. Now a lot of canvases are brilliant for oil painting and for acrylics, and I would highly recommend it for both, in this case for Artrage. Obviously your basic canvas through to your rough canvas to your smooth, almost like paper canvas. So we're going to start with the basic canvas, and you can see straight away the almost stylistic kind of cross-hatch pattern that you would get from a woven fabric stretched canvas. So we're going to hit the tick to that and OK it, and straight away, if I zoom out, you cannot see it at all. And as I zoom in, you can see the tiny lines that make up the pattern, both going horizontally and vertically. So go to oil and our normal brown brush for this, and we'll just pick a nice bright green, and we'll leave the brush at 52. And you can see that if I do straight strokes, you can see our brush strokes. As I push it out, you can see it brings out the texture, but we lose the brush strokes. The more you scrub this brush out, the more of the texture you can see as you scrub it out. Pretty much just like you run out of paint on the brush. As you run out of paint on the brush, you start to kind of dry the brush out, and you can see more of the texture just scrubbing against the grain of the paper. As I go around the edges of this paint, you can see it bringing the texture out. Note also that while I've got the brush strokes visible, it means that there is more paint down to where it's smooth, and you can see the texture of paper where there is less paint down. And if I try and scrub where it's smooth and try to scrub that out onto the paper, I get less of an effect than if I try to scrub where there is the brush strokes, which would indicate a lot more paint on the paper and therefore can go further when you're scrubbing it out. Okay, so that's your standard basic canvas. Now we're going to go back to canvas settings and look at a medium sort of canvas, which pretty much would be your essential, and you can see straight away you've got your kind of lines. I kind of describe this as a textured curtain, but I tend to get laughed at for saying that, but it does look like a textured curtain, don't get me wrong. I just wouldn't recommend painting on curtains, but you probably could if you tried stretching it onto a canvas. Stretching bars, I've never tried it, I might do that in the future. So hit tick and OK, and you can see this slightly mottled effect, and if we zoom in, you can see the actual texture of the canvas, very much like if you were using like a heavy duty calico. So we're gonna scrub in, and you can see straight away that we don't have our brush lines anymore because it's soaking into this paint is soaking into the canvas, and as I scrub out, you can see the texture of the canvas showing through. If I apply another colour, you can see how this scrubs out. There we go. If I go to the palette knives, tend to use a hard out smudge when I do this and just scrub out, and you can really see the texture coming through, just like if you were smudging paint out to a dry point on a canvas. There we go. Just smudge that around a bit more. Right, back to our canvas settings and our presets, and go back to canvas, and I'm just going to show you the smooth. You can see the kind of woven pattern that you get from a woven calico. So we'll load that, and if I zoom in, you can see all the lines. So let's give it some paint, and we're back again with our paint strokes and our brush strokes, as you can see, and obviously as we pull the paint out, you start to see more of the texture. So the smooth and the basic tend to be the paint doesn't soak into them as much as what it would, for example, on the rough and the essential canvases, which kind of, they tend to soak it up more, and therefore you lose your brush strokes. And if I go to our hard out smudge, and we just spread that out a bit, and you can see how that's picking out the texture of the canvas. Go back to our canvas settings and our presets. Now, another paper that I really like and often use with oil painting is something slightly different to a canvas. It is a grained paper rather than a canvas, so a bit like the sandy paper we use for the pastel, and it's the diagonal grain. And you see straight away it looks like standard typical Scottish rain going diagonally across everything, which it usually does up here. So I'll hit OK to that and load that, and you can see straight away, if I zoom in, you can see the diagonal lines. So back to our paintbrush, and if I scrub across, you can see the lines. And if I zoom in, you can see that we're getting our brush strokes, and as you push it around and it thins the paint out, more of the texture comes through. Also, this is a good way to see what I was referring to earlier about the canvas lighting. If I turned the canvas lighting off, you wouldn't see the shadowed edge, which runs along the edges of the diagonal grain in the paper. Just like if you'd had the paper lying down flat and you had the light pointing over the top, you would have a shadow down one side of the grain just from the angle of your light, and that gives you brings out the texture a lot more when you can see it, especially when you're painting and you want to be able to see what you're doing, whether you're working with the grain or against the grain. So that is the oil papers that I would recommend using in Artrage. So our final one that we are going to look at today for our papers for different medias is going to be pencil and charcoal. So we're going to go to new painting and our canvas settings again, and we are going to go to canvases, and we're going to go to our fine canvas. Now, the reason I want to go to fine canvas is because, as with most pencil and charcoal, you do want some texture, unless you want to do really fine kind of photorealistic pencil drawings, and then you want to be looking at a fine paper like the basic paper or the watercolour paper. So today we're just going to look at the fine canvas quickly and hit OK. Wait for that to load. If you zoom in, you can just about see, bear in mind I'm now 667% zoomed in, so let's zoom back out. And we are going to go to pencil. I actually use quite a lot of the different pencils in here, from the B shading to the hard tip to the hard shader. So we're just going to drop in the hard tip. We're also going to make the pencil size bigger, so we're going to take it to 100%. And if we just scratch across the paper and then zoom in, you can see that it has a slightly diffused edge on the pencil stroke, and that's just picking up the texture. Just like you'd get for if you use something like a Prismacolor pencil, where it's, in the words of another artist, creamy texture tends to be a softer edge. If I go to hard and dark, you can see that that's got a much more harsh edge, and you're not really seeing it pick up the texture because this is a fairly smoothish surface. If we go to the hard shader and across, you can see there it's also not picking up much as well. So that's perfect for the more like your kind of photorealistic drawings and things like that, which is not a problem. If you wonder what the jingling is, that's the kitten. She's just climbed up onto the desk to join me. She will probably start knocking things off shortly, so don't be surprised if you start hearing odd noises. So we're going to look at a slightly rougher paper, so we're going to go back to canvas and look at a rough, and straight away you can see that that's picking up the texture. And go back to our hard and dark, and also if I make it bigger, so 100%, and you can see that the edges are picking up the texture of the paper a lot better. If you really want to go for something like you're using the hard shader like you would charcoal, then I would probably recommend a canvas like the Essential canvas that we saw, that was fairly grainy in the horizontal and vertical direction. What else could we have? Rough papers are quite good as well, the coarse weave, the concrete and the stucco, you can see here. The concrete actually is quite good. Yes, it does look like concrete, but actually when you're working with it, let's take this to a black for example, and we'll make this much bigger, like we've got a stick of charcoal, and you can see where it's picking up the pits and lines that you would get if you were working with, well, for example, if you were drawing onto a pavement, I suppose, with chalks. Very, very similar. So if you go onto a soft tip, you can see that the soft tip pencil there is picking up quite a bit of it. And okay, the kitten's trying to chew the top of a paintbrush. Not clever. Hey Ava, not clever. Oh, I kind of want my paintbrushes in one piece, thank you. We will have a quick look at one more. And this is our lumpy paper. If I zoom in, you can just see that, and if I bring my soft pencil off, you can see it picks up the texture really nicely. If I do the same on my hard shader as well, and you can see picking up the bits and pieces. Ava, no. Thank you. She's just knocked a roll of washi tape off my desk. That'll keep her occupied for about 5 minutes rolling that round the floor. Ava, although I say she's a kitten, she is just coming up to 2 years old now. Does not act like an adult cat and probably won't do for a very long time. Mostly trained by my husband, so that's probably why. So yeah, you can see there the kind of things that you can achieve with the charcoal and the various pencils. You can stick to the rougher kind of canvases if you really want decent texture to kind of add depth into your work, or go for the finer papers if you want a more photorealistic look to your pencil and charcoal work. So that's about it for today, folks. It was a slightly longer session than planned. Remember to hit the thumbs up if you like my video, and also subscribe to see more, and hopefully we will see you at the next one. Good night for now.